Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us here today. I'm Tahia Islam, and I'm a part of the education team here at the People's Forum. For those of us that are new to TPF, we are a political education and cultural center for working class internationalist movement building based in New York City on Lenape land. You can see our website, peoplesforum.org, for information on upcoming events and classes. We're now back open, so you can come to our space from Tuesdays to Saturdays, 11 a.m. to 9 p.m. So please stop by. So welcome to our second session of the Histories of the Working Class in North America. This is a new series here at TPF that puts researchers and scholars into conversation with organizers, students, and teachers engaged in working class anti-racist struggles. We want to better understand North American working class life in order to apply lessons to organizing today. The majority of us, no matter our level of education, have been taught history from the perspective of our exploiters, which obscures the real history, the fights, and it forestalls future victories. So for today's talk on work, community, and memory on California's Round Valley Reservation, we will hear from scholar and historian Dr. William Bauer on how Round Valley Indians in the 19th and 20th centuries adapted and resisted to social and economic realities to preserve tribal identity and enable survival. Dr. William Bauer is a professor of history and a citizen of the Round Valley Reservation in Northern California. Prior to today's talk, a cohort of organizers read chapters of his book, We Were All Like Migrant Workers Here, Work, Community, and Memory on California's Round Valley Reservation, 1850 to 1941, which was published in 2009. We developed some questions, and we'll also open the floor to Q&A to the public at the end of today's talk. So if you're here on Zoom, you can use the Q&A function, and if you're on YouTube, you can use the live chat. So with that, I pass it over. Thank you so much, Willy, for joining us, and we look forward to hearing you.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited to be doing this and to kind of talk about my work in kind of this unique and kind of important setting, right? So, anyways, again, my name is William Bauer. I'm an enrolled citizen of the Round Valley Indian tribes of Northern California and a professor of history at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And today I'm speaking to you from Southern Paiute lands located in Nevada. I would like to thank Tahia for asking me to do this talk and for setting up everything. I know some of us might be a bit tired of doing Zoom events and that sort of thing. But I think one of the benefits of the pandemic has been kind of figuring out how to do events like this, where we're all kind of virtual and we can kind of talk and interact in this kind of setting. This past year, for instance, I've presented virtually in Chicago at a conference in Chicago, in the United Kingdom, and now in New York City. And I'm not sure I would have had those opportunities in the last year to talk about my research and other things that I've been working on if it hadn't been for Zoom and some of these other kind of new developments. So I'm very grateful for that I'm here and that we can be kind of doing and working on this project and kind of discussing this work today. Thank you for asking me to talk about kind of my work on kind of American Indian work and labor history, and then kind of on the focus of my own book, which is entitled "We Were All Like Migrant Workers Here: Work, Memory, and Community on the Round Valley Reservation, 1850 to 1941." And here's a copy. Right, I have to do shameless self-promotion about the book. The book was very much kind of a revised version of my doctoral dissertation, which I completed at the University of Oklahoma. And so what I plan to do for everyone tonight is to kind of give an overview of what I tried to do in the book, kind of some main themes and main topics, and then kind of open it up for a question and answer and be able to kind of engage and talk about the book with everyone. And so I'm doing this on my iPad, so maybe some of the technology might be a bit clunky today. So please bear with me. So the title of my book, right, is We Were All Like Migrant Workers Here: Work, Community, and Memory on California's Round Valley Reservation, 1850 to 1941. There again, right, is the shameless self-promotion, is the picture of the book, and maybe as a little bit of orientation on where we're talking about and what we're doing here. And so the Round Valley Reservation is located in Northern California. So that's, you kind of see kind of a handwritten, hand-drawn map of Northern California in the top box there on the slide or on your screen. It's about 150 to 180 miles north of the San Francisco Bay Area. It's north, kind of northwest of Sacramento, which is the state capital of California. And then on the bottom picture of the slide is a picture of the Round Valley area of the Round Valley area. So my book explores the history of Indigenous people from Northern California's Round Valley Reservation as essentially, right, as farm workers. I came to this topic from two ways, or from two perspectives. I recall writing a paper in a graduate seminar, a graduate class, which actually became parts of chapters 3 and 4 of the book. And some of you, as been mentioned before, had the opportunity to read chapter 4 in the introduction before tonight's event. And so as I was doing the research for this, I came across many sources that were discussing Round Valley Indians doing work like picking hops and picking other agricultural crops on the reservation, but also in kind of the larger areas kind of surrounding the reservation. And I got I kind of glommed onto those topics based on my own, based on those kind of primary sources, right? The things on which historians typically rely and write our histories. Obviously, too, right? California has a long history of migrant farm workers, but as I read other books and other works on California migrant farm workers, American Indians didn't pop up, so there wasn't a lot of discussion of American Indians in that scholarship. Additionally, my advisor, who was Albert Hurtado, who wrote a book called Indian Survival on the California Frontier, had also addressed issues related to California Indian labor, but in a different time period, from 1840 to 1860. And so I began to kind of think about the role of California Indian labor, principally kind of migrant farm work, in a broader history of California, Additionally, we tend to know American Indian history and American Indian people, I think, both in the present and in the past, through a lens of unemployment. As in, one of the things that American Indians lack are good employment opportunities. And so if you kind of look at any or see any kind of news story about American Indian people, if you see it in print or on TV, they'll always inevitably kind of mention the high unemployment rates that exist on reservations. That's obviously true, right? Reservations have kind of areas that sometimes don't offer kind of employment opportunities, but I would argue that's a product of history. In that I built on the work of other scholars, other people who who study the history of American Indians and work and labor, to kind of talk about this longer history of American Indian work, and in the sense that this kind of what we know now as kind of high rates of unemployment in the present are actually kind of the product of history, right? The product of land dispossession. They're the product of other kind of economic forces that have shaped American Indian lives. And if we actually kind of read back onto the past and we look back into the past, we actually kind of see a rich and robust history of American Indians at work in the late 19th and early 20th century. And so I really kind of wanted to kind of contribute and kind of speak to that. And so, yes, right, I as a historian, I tended to kind of rely on and use the typical kind of sources that all historians use, right? Primary documents. But I did kind of come to a realization that primary sources, written things about American Indians, were only going to be they would only be able to kind of partially help me tell my story. And so I relied heavily on oral histories with people from the Round Valley Reservation. And so I was able to kind of interview my grandmother for this project. I was able to interview my great aunt, and they provided voices that I think that were kind of important and necessary for me to tell the story. When I first went to graduate school, I knew I wanted to include oral histories as a research methodology and a research approach. when people have written about the Round Valley Reservation in the past, they tended to focus on the 19th century and heavily relied on non-native produced sources. And so one of the things, at least initially when I began to kind of work on this project, one of the important points about using oral histories was that oral histories kind of provided a native voice for what was being for those historical practices, and also brought that story into the 20th and now right into the 21st century. And so I thought that oral history was kind of vital initially to that project, and it became apparent as I was doing more research on kind of American Indians and work and in labor that it was absolutely necessary to do oral history. So, for instance, I would go to the archives. One of the kind of the things I remember most is going to the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And again, kind of reading a lot of reports produced by non-native people, principally people who work for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The Bureau of Indian Affairs would often staff reservations, reservation administration, right? So that non-native peoples would be in charge of reservations in California and also in the rest of the United States. And so I would read their reports, and they would often say, people from the reservation have left and are picking hops. And I kind of got to a point where I would be like, well, yeah, I know that, right? All the primary sources, all the written sources were telling me this story. What I didn't know and what I couldn't understand from these archival sources was what was it like to actually pick hops? What was it like to kind of pack up one's family in August and begin to travel around California, picking grapes, again, picking hops, performing a number of other kind of agricultural activities? I didn't know, why would they even do that? What was kind of the impetus and the role or the impetus behind this kind of practice, right? So these are things that I couldn't understand about the laboring experience of Round Valley Indians unless I went and did kind of oral histories and oral history interviews. And so I was vital, and I was thankful for everyone who wanted to work with me and shared with me their life histories and their experiences doing this kind of migrant farm work in the 1930s and in the early 20th century. And so oral history was vital for having me provide information that I couldn't find in the usual and customary archives. But as I more kind of thought about kind of these oral histories and these oral perspectives, one of the things that I noted was how these oral histories kind of began to shape the methodology and the way in which I began to interpret the past. And so, right, if you look at the title of the book, "We Were All Like Migrant Workers Here," that comes from a quote that my great aunt, Kathy Cook, gave me during our interview, right? She said, that was one of the things that she said, I asked her, well, did you ever kind of go pick hops? And she said, yeah, we were all like migrant workers here. And that became something kind of quite interesting, is every person that I interviewed remembered going and at work and being migrant farm workers as children, and how kind of formative of an experience that was for them. But also that was something that I think kind of got lost in our generation for generations. So I didn't know that my grandmother was a migrant farm worker. I grew up on a ranch. I did those kind of, so I'm kind of accustomed to kind of ranch and farm and agricultural work, but I didn't know kind of the extent to which kind of native peoples from Round Valley were doing that. So it became kind of very kind of informative to be able to kind of tell those stories to my generation and other generation of people on the reservation. But also I began to kind of recognize how Round Valley Indians began to kind of interpret historical change. So they began to kind of, through their own oral histories and their perspectives on the past, they began to kind of interpret it from their own perspective. So they began to, one of the things that I remember, for instance, that's in the book, is that they began to make a definition of they defined poverty, right? So rather than poverty being kind of an absence of kind of goods, native peoples would kind of define poverty as kind of a lack of food. And as long as they had food, they didn't consider themselves to be quote unquote poor. And so I began to kind of be kind of quite influenced, and I tried to abide this kind of methodological and interpretive framework that was being provided by these oral histories. And so hopefully that kind of comes through as we get through the text. So in general, right, the book argues that Round Valley Indians maintained a sense of community using migrant farm work. meaning that when they participated in migrant farm labor in the 19th and 20th centuries, they did so in ways that were attempting to kind of rebuild and restore community. This was vitally important in California and in the United States for indigenous peoples, right? Because in the 19th and in the 20th centuries, the United States, the state of California, was enacting and putting forward policies that were attempting to undermine community structures for Native peoples. They wanted to detribalize, right? Undo the kind of the tribal affiliations of indigenous peoples. They wanted to kind of break up indigenous families. And so migrant farm work becomes a way for Round Valley Indians to maintain a sense of community and maintain kind of family structures through in the 19th and 20th centuries. As I think back about the book now, I think I could have made a kind of a stronger case about tribal sovereignty, right? I think that the argument and to kind of think through the ways in which kind of Round Valley Indians kind of used and thought about community in the 19th and 20th centuries was vitally important, especially kind of given the kind of the parameters of federal Indian policy and its way of kind of undermining community structures and undermining kind of indigenous life. But I do see kind of the way in which I think that that this community, that kind of the way in which kind of Round Valley Indians stuck together on the reservation in the 19th and 20th centuries allowed them then to put forward and create kind of tribal governance structures during the Great Depression. And I think if I kind of made that point kind of a little bit stronger, and we can maybe talk about that in the Q&A. Before kind of launching on to how, what I accomplished in the book or what I write about throughout the text, I will say the Round Valley Reservation is a bit kind of unique maybe for other reservations in the United States. It's a multi-tribal reservation. There are members of 7 to 8 different California Indian tribes that were forcibly relocated to the reservation. And so it's this kind of, it very much kind of turned into kind of this kind of meeting ground between different indigenous peoples and Native peoples from across the state of California as they come to the reservation in Northern California. So the book is divided into 8 chapters. In chapter 1, which is entitled Making the World in a Basket, Work, Labor, and Community in Ancient Time California, I wanted to make the argument that California Indians possessed ideas about work and labor before the arrival of Europeans. And then those ideas about work and labor kind of carried on into the 19th and into the 20th centuries. And so, for instance, Native Californians understood creation, the process of the creation of the world, as an aspect of, as kind of an example of work and labor. That in that creator figures literally made the world as kind of an act of work. One creation story, for instance, recalled that the creation of Round Valley. I'm going to kind of scroll back up to kind of put that the picture of Round Valley in the top of the screen there, right? Round Valley by name is a round valley, right? It's a valley that is surrounded by mountains. And in the creation story, then they understood, they depicted the creation of Round Valley, the creation of that place, in much the same way that Native women wove baskets, like you see here pictured here. So they kind of thought about it, or they depicted the creation of the world in a way that was very similar to the process of the work related to making baskets. And so the argument there is that that work and labor was kind of vital to the way in which kind of the world, from a California Indian perspective, was created. Secondly, California Indians possess a belief in something called industriousness, meaning that hard work was valued in California Indian communities before the arrival of Europeans. And so that California Indian women and men, when they were looking for partners with which to kind of create families, always look forward people who did kind of a lot of hard work, or who would be able to contribute to each other and form a family. So this kind of notion of industriousness was vitally important to the way in which kind of California Indian communities and families were structured and created even before the arrival of Europeans. And in this way, right, work and labor was essential to California Indian communities before the arrival of Europeans. And I don't think that a lot of people kind of typically kind of think about that. They don't think about kind of often I think people kind of think about work and labor being as a product of kind of introduction to kind of capitalist modes of production, or very much kind of an aspect of kind of modernity. And I try to kind of read that back into the past to kind of talk about the ways in which kind of work and labor were important to Native Californians as they formed communities even before the arrival of Europeans. And I think, and obviously, right, to get at that, I think oral histories, oral traditions, and oral narratives were vitally important for me to kind of hopefully kind of tell that story over the course of the book. The second chapter is entitled They, White People, Made Slaves of Indians, Forced Labor in the Nome Colt Valley, 1850 to 1865. The Nome Colt Valley was the kind of the first name for Round Valley. Round Valley gets kind of renamed in the 1850s and the 1860s. And again, what you'll see throughout is I do take some of my chapter titles from oral history interviews with people, and so this is one of those examples of that practice. Right, is that they, white people, made slaves of Indians comes from an oral history an oral history interview with someone from the Round Valley Reservation. So in the 1850s and then the 1860s, the state of California and the federal government created systems of forced labor and or slavery, the enslavement of indigenous peoples in California. So the federal government, for instance, when it created a reservation in Round Valley, forced or compelled California Indians to work on the newly created reservation for food sources. So what we see in California is essentially rape processes of ethnic cleansing in which indigenous peoples are forcibly removed from their homelands, pushed onto reservations throughout the state, including in Round Valley. And once there, they're forced or they're required to work for their food and other food, clothing, and other resources. This makes it a little bit different than other reservations, say in the rest of the United States, which had treaty arrangements which allowed for the distribution of rations and annuities to reservation residents. In California and Round Valley, right, there's this kind of effort where there's the kind of there necessarily was the kind of the same treaty relationship, and so these rations and annuities weren't forthcoming in the same way. And so so the federal government forced or compelled California Indians to work for their work for rations and clothes. And so what we see here, the picture that's also kind of that was on the slide or that was advertising this talk today is this picture. This is essentially kind of a group of California Indians on the reservation who are preparing. It's basically kind of a group of workers who are preparing to go to work on the reservation. The men on the kind of the left-hand side, the white men, those were the federal officials there or Indian agents that were hired to oversee the administration on the reservation. So what we're kind of this kind of picture comes from the kind of the late 1850s and early 1860s, kind of from the reservation. But the state of California also had an active role in placing American Indians into unfree, if not enslaved conditions. One of the first pieces of legislation enacted by the state of California is something called the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians. As my advisor kind of wrote in his book, the act did a lot more governing than protecting of Indians. But one of the provisions of the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians was a system whereby indigenous children could be made into indentured servants or indentured laborers. And so what happened throughout the state of California is that California citizens used the provisions of the Act for the Government and Protection of Indians to essentially enslave California, especially kind of California Indian young men and women, children, essentially children, in the 1850s and carrying on into the 1860s into the Civil War. But as much as I kind of talk about kind of the forced labor that happened on reservations, the slavery that happened off reservations in Northern California, I did want to also kind of focus in on California Indian perspectives and how they understood their work and labor relations. And I did kind of tend to kind of focus a little bit more here in this chapter on aspects of California Indian resistance, meaning that California Indian workers under these forced labor regimes and under slavery did resist, right? So they would do the same things that I think we've read about, You might know about kind of other workers in the 19th and 20th century, both free and unfree and unfree workers and enslaved workers, right? So when they were tired of working conditions, they left, right? They ran away from the reservation. They ran away from the conditions in which that held them in bondage. They might break tools to kind of slow down the production process. And in some cases, especially enslaved Indians, killed their masters, right? And so there are kind of these examples of kind of resistance that we see kind of existing kind of on the reservation and on and off the reservation in the 1850s and the 1860s. Chapter 3 was entitled "They Were Kept Busy at All Times: Mobility, Cash Wages, and the Reconstruction of Labor Relations in Round Valley, 1865 to 1880." And so what I tried to discuss here, right, is if the South undergoes a process of reconstruction after the American Civil War, which ends that nominally ends slavery, so too did Round Valley, California, and the American West, right? So what we see here is society in Northern California making a transition from a system of forced labor and/or slavery to a system that might nominally or kind of look like what we would call free labor, where Native peoples are working for wages, right? As in the South, right? It's fits and starts. It's an incomplete process. I think that goes on in Northern California. The federal government still compelled Round Valley Indians to work on the reservation for food and rations. However, rations and food were consistently inadequate. The federal government failed to adequately provision the reservation in the 1850s, in the 1860s, and in the 1870s. Furthermore, the federal government failed to prevent white men from coming onto reservation lands and then essentially acting as squatters, right, taking over, grazing livestock essentially, right, on reservation lands. And so Round Valley Indians faced kind of severe kind of food shortages and lack of clothing and other provisions. And so they made the decision to leave the reservation, often temporarily, to work. The attraction is that if they left the reservation to work, if they left the reservation to kind of pick hops, which we'll talk about here in a couple minutes, or do other kinds of farm labor or agricultural labor, they were paid with cash wages. And if they had cash wages, then they could go to stores and they could buy things, right? They could buy their own food, they could buy their own clothes. It kind of empowered Round Valley Indians to be able to kind of become their own consumers and find and provision themselves when the federal government was doing a terrible job of doing so. The other reason that Round Valley Indians left the reservation to participate in migrant farm work or in labor off the reservation is that it got them away from government surveillance, right? On reservations, the federal government attempted to kind of assimilate, to forcibly change American Indian culture. This meant that they tried to change American Indian family practices. They tried to stamp out American Indian religious practices. They tried to stamp out what they considered to be kind of or traditional kind of recreational activities on the part of Round Valley and of American Indians in the United States. And so when Round Valley Indians left the reservation to work, they escaped government surveillance. They essentially could do what they wanted kind of off the reservation when they were participating in work. And so one of the things that they like to do while going off and working is kind of depicted here, is that they like to gamble, right? So that Northern California Indians would play a game called grass game, in which, right, two teams would sit kind of opposing one another, as we kind of see these the people in the picture kind of in a circle here. And then they would have bones, and they would shuffle bones underneath a blanket. And then the opposing team had to bet on the order in which those bones were shuffled. And then people would bet and see who was right, who was wrong, and that sort of thing. But these gambling games were quite popular off reservations, because Round Valley Indians knew that once they left the reservations, they were on their kind of own, kind of working in these kind of activities. They had the freedom, the ability to kind of engage in recreational activities as they saw fit. And one of the most kind of important places, I think, where this happened, or one of the most important places where Round Valley Indians kind of engaged in this kind of farm work and this kind of exercising this kind of freedom and that sort of thing, was while picking hops, right? And so in the late 19th and into the 20th century in California was one of the kind of the largest hop producers in the United States. Indeed, kind of the West Coast, California, Oregon, Washington was kind of a prominent place for hop production in the United States. And in those three states, especially in Northern California, they relied on American Indians to serve as the workforce, essentially from the beginning of the year of kind of preparing the fields to crops, to putting up hop poles, which you see here pictured, in the picture, and then finally when it was ready to pick the hops, right? Native peoples across the Washington, Oregon, and California descended on hop ranches and picked the crops. This was the kind of the chapter that a lot of you read, or some of you read. We can kind of talk a little bit more about it. But I think in this chapter, what I do is I kind of go into kind of the reasons why Round Valley Indians participated in the hop industry in Northern California. And I principally make the argument they do so for three reasons. One, again, is to earn cash wages. Two is to move as family units and to kind of maintain family connections. And three is to participate in activities that the federal government did not want them to participate on reservations. And so one example of this in the 1870s is that California Indians participated in something called the Ghost Dance, right? So there's kind of two waves of the Ghost Dance. The more famous wave of the Ghost Dance is in 1890, the one that kind of begins here, like in northern Nevada, where I am, and then goes out onto the Great Plains and is kind of the precipitating event for the Wounded Knee Massacre on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. But before that, there was another wave of the Ghost Dance that spread through Northern California and Southern Oregon. And one of the places where people began to learn about and practice the Ghost Dance was on hop ranches and during the hop season. Hop picking season. And so kind of the hop industry and Round Valley Indians participation in the hop industry, I think, was one of these kind of vital ways in which Round Valley Indians kind of can maintain and maintain their community. And we can kind of flesh that out and talk about this chapter, hopefully in the Q&A. Chapter 5 then kind of is entitled From Farm Workers to Farm Workers, Land, Labor, and Allotment, 1900 to 1917. And so what we see in the late 19th and early 20th century is a policy of forced assimilation on reservations. On one hand, they wanted to put American Indians into off-reservation boarding schools. And so what you see here pictured, this is a picture of the Round Valley Reservation in the late 19th century, turn of the century. And this is a picture of the Round Valley Indian School, which where many Native children went to go. So kind of I talk about a little bit about the education programs during this time period. But also I talk about a policy called allotment. So in the late 19th and early 20th century, the federal government initiated a policy called allotment, which calls for the surveying of reservation lands, the distribution of private property or of lands to individual heads of household. And with the purpose, at least in Round Valley, to transform Round Valley Indians from farm workers. So they didn't want American Round Valley Indians to go off and pick hops anymore in the 20th century. They wanted them to stay on the reservation and work on their own farms. So the goal of allotment policy was to transform American Round Valley Indians from farm workers into farmers. But as the title of the chapter suggests, that policy failed. It actually kind of reinforced the reasons why Round Valley Indians kind of participated as migrant farm workers in the 20th century. One of the reasons for this is that land allotments, the plots of land that Round Valley Indians received in the 20th century were between 5 and 10 acres. 5 and 10 acres of land. There's no way in Northern California that one can provide a sustainable farming enterprise on 5 to 10 acres of land. I mean, if you look on the Great Plains, for instance, Native peoples received allotments of between 160 and 320 acres at the same time period. And the allotment policy failed there as well, right? So what we see here is that since Round Valley Indians received such kind of small kind of plots of land, they had to kind of continue to kind of go off and participate in migrant farm work. to again kind of make ends meet and that sort of thing. And so kind of in chapter 6, I kind of talk about the ramifications of that policy. Right, so the title of that chapter is "They Gave All They Were Going to Give to the Indians: Round Valley Indian Work, Labor, and Community in 1900 to 1917." And in this chapter, this is actually this chapter was not in my dissertation. It's a chapter that I wrote specifically for the book. And what I do here is I center on the lives of 3 young men and women on the reservation. A guy by the name of Charles Dorman, another young man named Ben Neefus, and then a young woman named Minnie Graves. And I explore their labor activities on both on and off the reservation at the turn of the century. And one of the ways in which one of the things I do here in this chapter is I talk about the role of boarding schools in terms of Round Valley Indian work and labor. Boarding schools were unique, right? So both Minnie Graves and Ben Neefus went to off-reservation boarding schools. These off-reservation boarding schools had policies intended to kind of train Round Valley Indians to be either better farm workers or kind of get jobs in the Indian service. Ben Neefus, for instance, began working on a reservation in South Dakota, right? So he graduated from a boarding school and then went to work in South Dakota. But also, if we kind of think about it, what boarding schools did is they took family labor, like they sent children who were essential parts of labor in Round Valley Indian families, and it took them away from their families, right? So if the children are in off-reservation boarding schools, for instance, in Southern California or in Nevada or in Oregon, they're not with their families, and they're not like this picture here. This is a young woman in Mendocino County, and then outside the grape fields, right? So she'd been helping her family, right, pick grapes. And so if children are taken away from their families, then families have a much more difficult time being able to kind of make ends meet on and off the reservation. So I kind of get at the ways in which kind of failed allotment policies here and the education system kind of really kind of undermine kind of family labor practices on and off the reservation. Chapter 7 was entitled Indian Labor in War and Peace, 1917 to 1929. And I kind of build on that experience with the boarding schools. And so I begin this chapter thinking about World War I, right? World War I, again, takes young men away from the reservation, depriving their families of labor, right? So families lost kind of the working abilities of young men between 1917 and 1919 during the war. And then after the war, government agents and then wartime experiences continue to do this, or continue to deprive Native families of their work of work and labor. So, for instance, agents often didn't want young men to come back to the reservation once their wartime service was completed. Right? I mean, I've encountered letters where the agent at the reservation was writing to officials trying to keep young men from returning to the reservation and coming back and helping their families. But also young men were wounded in war, right? And so young wounded men are those who come back to the reservation, but they can't work for their families as much as they had in the past. And so, kind of World War I really kind of harmed American Indian families, both during the war and then after the war in the 1920s, as federal agents and also kind of the ramifications of the conflict kind of prevented young men from getting back into the or contributing to their families. And then I kind of conclude the book with chapter 8, Building Bridges and Telling Stories, Labor During the Great Depression. As with many people across the United States during the Great Depression, Round Valley Indians faced labor securities or labor scarcities throughout, right? There weren't a lot of jobs. But Round Valley Indians took advantage of public works opportunities that occurred during the Great Depression. And so one of the public works projects that I talk about in the book is building a bridge across a river for a couple of families on and off the reservation to kind of be able to access the railroad. And I was able to interview two of the men who worked on that project and how kind of formative of an experience it was for them during the Great Depression. And then the other aspect of kind of public works during the Great Depression was an oral history project. So a group of anthropologists came up to the reservation and began to interview elderly men and women to kind of talk about their experiences and share oral traditions with them. In a way, it was a state-sponsored project that was kind of like the WPA slave narratives. And so what we see here is Round Valley Indians kind of using unique kind of public history or public works opportunities to kind of alleviate the kind of the negative impacts of the Great Depression. And I think this is another reason kind of in the book here in 1941. The Great Depression pretty much ended the hop industry in Mendocino County, especially for kind of migrant farm workers. The hop industry began to become mechanized roughly about 1941. And more Round Valley and more Native peoples began to kind of not participate in migrant farm work, roughly, right after the Great Depression. So it kind of offered a way to kind of end the book without kind of diving into kind of World War II and other kind of economic activities that were going on and off the reservation. I'd like to conclude. I know I've gone a little bit long here, so sorry about that. But maybe kind of talking about how this has shaped kind of my other work and my other research and my scholarship, principally kind of focused in Northern California. And so the second book that I wrote was entitled California Through Native Eyes, Reclaiming History. And so what I did is I went back to that New Deal era public works project where California Indians were interviewed for their oral histories and oral traditions. And one of the reasons when I went back to this is that my great-grandfather, who was named Charles Wright, was interviewed, or he got a job on that public works project to share oral histories and oral traditions. And what I make the argument there is that not only did California Indians kind of earn some kind of wage, right, during the Great Depression by working on that public works project, is that they crafted an alternative narrative, an alternative history of California, right? So their oral traditions kind of narrated a history of California that was purposefully kind of contradictory to the other narratives about California history that were being perpetuated by professional and local historians. And so I very much kind of used that work being done. I kind of thought about the work being done during the Great Depression by my great-grandfather and other Native peoples on the reservation to kind of think about how they began to kind of interpret the past and their kind of current living conditions in the 1930s. And then the book that has just been published here in actually this year, 2020, is a co-authored book with Damon Akins, who teaches at Guilford College in North Carolina. It's entitled "We Are the Land: A History of Native California." It's a survey of California Indian history from creation to 2020, right? So we were actually able to kind of include aspects of how California Indian nations responded to and shaped the kind of the COVID-19 pandemic. But I think I think that book does kind of reflect also both of our interests and my interest in kind of the working and economic conditions of California. And so we kind of talk about the ways in which kind of California Indians have maintained connections with the land of California as Spain, Mexico, and the state of California and the United States have attempted to dispossess California Indians of the land. And one of the ways in which they do so is through work and labor practices. And so I think these, I think, it's kind of thinking about kind of where I've been as a scholar since the beginning of, or since writing We Were All Like Migrant Workers Here, is kind of obviously kind of a focus on kind of oral histories and oral tradition, but also kind of the vital importance of kind of work and labor in California Indian history and hopefully in the rest of the United States. So thank you, everyone.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Willy, for walking us through this incredible history that was, honestly, a lot of us were in awe of the way it's been visualized in our education and the ways in which the Round Valley Indians defined labor for themselves and defined themselves as workers. So thank you for running us through. We were all like migrant workers here. And I think one of the first questions that came to mind from our cohort of organizers who read the 2 chapters is about your method of oral traditions. And in relation to the 2 books you brought up at the end, what has the evolution been of carrying these oral histories and putting them into your texts since the book was published in 2009? We're thinking a lot about new popular methods of media, podcasts or social media. Yeah. So how has that formed into 2021?
Yeah, that's a great question. I should so yeah, I think that's one of the those things that happens, right? When I did the book and I did those oral history interviews many years ago, it was very much I think before kind of these developments, and I haven't thought about how to use them or maybe kind of spread them to kind of a broader audience since then. I mean, I think partly is that some people at the time didn't kind of want kind of a broad kind of broadcast of their oral histories. I was very thankful that people wanted to do the oral history interviews with me, and I was very supportive that people from my own community would help me out. But also I think some of them just kind of wanted to keep that private between us. Well, and obviously allow it in the book, but also just kind of keep it for themselves. So for instance, I interviewed my grandmother, and she was quite adamant. She was like, you're not going to videotape me or record this. You're gonna have to write it all down by hand. And my grandmother was kind of an argumentative woman sometimes, and so I kind of got why she was doing that. But I think it's empowering for the people being interviewed, right, to be able to kind of take control of their own kind of intellectual product there, and allow them to do that. So I think I'd have to kind of think. I think it would be kind of interesting to kind of think about kind of other kind of alternative ways of kind of working with this material, especially in light, as you kind of said, with kind of new technologies and new opportunities.
Yeah. Are you seeing it all? Like younger generations of Native Americans taking it on themselves, starting these new forms of media, telling their own stories in that way?
Yeah, I think there's a couple. I can't remember the name of the podcast right now. It's escaping me. Well, she did the one that I'm thinking of right now was called This Land. And it was a podcast on a court case that was decided last fall called Mcgirt versus Oklahoma, and it was a really kind of a fascinating kind of exploration about kind of why a court case, why kind of a murder in Oklahoma kind of matters, both kind of historically and in the present day. And so what I think the kind of the podcast was able to do was kind of trace through kind of the history of kind of land and dispossession for Indigenous peoples in what is now kind of the modern day state of Oklahoma, and kind of their victory at the Supreme Court, and the reasons why the Supreme Court kind of recognized that their reservation boundaries were still intact. So I think that's one of the kind of, I use that in classes. For instance, I have my classes listen to the podcast, and then we kind of discuss and use it in that way. So yeah, I think there's some really kind of great kind of native podcasts that are getting that are out there.
Cool. Thank you for sharing that. We have to check it out. And I also just want to say, we have the Q&A open for folks, attendees in Zoom. You can put it in Q&A. And also we have a couple of questions coming in from YouTube, so I'll read those out as well. But I think I'm going to backtrack for a second. I think like going back to how we just were in shock reading this history and the ways in which they define themselves as workers. Why in our education have we learned more about that unemployment aspect? Why has Native American labor been invisibilized in our history? And we also wonder, as organizers, how do we combat that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I'm not sure I have the best answer for that yet, right? I think part of it is how people kind of understand contemporary American Indians, right? I think like if you think about kind of contemporary issues, if anyone kind of does kind of modern kind of media depictions of Indigenous peoples, they often kind of do focus on what is called quote unquote the plight of Indigenous peoples in the United States. And that's not to say that this long history of land dispossession, ethnic cleansing, and genocide does not have kind of contemporary impacts, right? I'm not trying to kind of minimize that, but I do think that sometimes when people kind of think about American Indians, they think of them only as impoverished, dispossessed, and unemployed. So I think it kind of fits into that trope and that narrative. And then I think that was one of the things that me and some other scholars have kind of done is kind of point into. I mean, I think that when I published the book, I was building on kind of the work of a couple other scholars who only were focusing on kind of American Indian labor. So there's the spate of works on American Indian labor, both in the United States and in Canada. I think in kind of constructive way, in helpful ways to kind of think through this kind of on the other side of the northern border. And I think that one of the things that we accomplished was actually kind of getting people to kind of think through kind of this history of American Indian labor, that there is a history of American Indian labor. It's not only a history of unemployment. But what I think that we need to do now is put more kind of emphasis on the 1950s and the 1960s, maybe even into the 1970s, because I think that's where the pivot happens about these kind of high rates of unemployment. There were, I think that I would kind of timidly say, right, so in the 1960s, what we see is Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs that provide a lot of kind of grant funding and programs for kind of economic development on reservations in the 60s and 70s that offered a kind of employment opportunities for Native peoples to stay on reservations. Then in the late 70s and early 80s under the Reagan administration, a lot of that funding was cut out. And so there wasn't the same kind of employment opportunities that existed for Native peoples there. So I think that is kind of part of the history. And so, and I don't think that we quite understand what happens in the 50s and 60s on reservations as well as we need to. That would kind of help us to kind of answer that question. I've said in kind of other examples or other kind of writings that I've done, I think the issue is not an unemployment problem historically for American Indians, right? That's not, again, not to kind of diminish the high rates of unemployment that does exist on some reservations in the present day. But the problem has always been underemployment. I think that the only kind of economic opportunities that were around reservations, on and off reservations, that I try to kind of discuss in the book and in my kind of talk today, tended to just be kind of migrant farm work. And other kind of low-paying jobs. Moreover, when Native children would go to boarding schools, they were often taught, or they would be put to work as migrant farm workers. So in Southern California, there was a place called the Sherman Indian Institute, which was an off-reservation boarding school for Native peoples in California, but also from Arizona. Native kids would be brought from across, from those states to work. And in the summer, they would be put to work picking citrus or working on citrus farms in Southern California. That's not any different than the work they would be doing if they'd stayed on the reservation. And so even then, I think we see kind of failed federal policies contribute a lot to the kind of the underdevelopment of American Indian economies on and near reservations.
Yeah, thank you for walking us through that. And I'd be interested to see some of the histories of 1950s and 1960s, and even learning about in the 19th and 20th centuries. I mean, seeing themselves take ownership of their own labor, building community on the hop fields, pooling wages, bringing their families with them, maintaining culture. There's a lot of resistance, beautiful resistance there that we can learn from in our own working class struggles. That for us as organizers, we see there's a reason why that was obscured.
Exactly right, and that was actually one of the kind of the endearing quality of the book that I always kind of think back fondly. And that was stuff that I could not have gotten without doing those oral history interviews, right? There was, the primary documents with which I mostly worked would never discuss that. And one of the reasons for it is that they didn't have access to that world, right? They didn't have access to the workers' world, essentially, right, in Round Valley. And it was only through oral histories that I was able to kind of get at that. One of my favorite interviews, oral history interviews or favorite discussions, was I was talking to a woman, her name was Arvella Freeman, and she was talking about going as a young girl and working in the hop fields. And she remembered that she and her dad would work all day, they'd pick hops, and then at night they would play grass game. Her dad would play grass game, right? That gambling game that I talked a little bit about earlier in the discussion. And she remembered that she would lay on her dad's back because he gambled late into the night. And that's how she would fall asleep every night, is she would be kind of laying on her dad's back, kind of getting at that experience, and that was kind of one of her memories of it, of picking hops. And that, again, that's not something that I could ever get from the primary sources, from the archive, from the government made archive. And it was just kind of this tender moment that I kind of always kind of take with me from that experience. And that's not to say that Native peoples kind of enjoyed the work, right? Arvella, for instance, was quite adamant that she did not often like picking hops. She told me this story that she found hops growing wild someplace, like where in Round Valley, and she tore those vines down because she did not remember liking the job experience that much, right? So there's, I mean, I think as with a lot of kind of labor experiences, right, there's a kind of a tension between, I think, as you're saying, right, the camaraderie and the organizations that we can kind of do on work sites, and some of the maybe kind of mundane things that we don't like about our work environments. But again, I think that was stuff that I could only get by doing kind of the oral histories, kind of doing these oral history interviews with people.
Definitely. And by making that decision to, I guess, migrate over to the hop fields for their work, they were able to build almost like solidarity communities. They brought over families, right? They met with other tribes and other groups as well. Can you talk a little bit more about that, as well as we were thinking on our end, how do we create these like self-sustaining solidarity and striking communities in our own workplaces now? So it's like a kind of a two-part question.
Yeah, so that was one of the things. So I think to answer the easy question first, right? I think one of the things that I was struck by was actually, that was one thing I was not anticipating necessarily, is the kind of the family structure and the family bonds that were strengthened in the workplace. Meaning that when people would go to pick hops, for instance, they would do so as families. It would be kind of the mother, the father, the children, they were all going, right? They were all going. And as you kind of pointed out, it's one of the reasons that they did that is that they pooled their wages. And so that children would be working alongside their parents and their grandparents, and everyone would pool their wages for the family. I have this kind of great, I couldn't find it. I think it's on my office computer or somewhere, kind of hidden on some kind of file. But there's a great picture that I found from Northern California about a young man. It had a picture of a young man, and then he had, I think, like essentially his grandmother kind of next to him, and then and so so on one hand, right, you understand, like, we have families working together. But then when I had heard other oral histories about what happened in the fields, is that I realized that what would happen is that younger people would go and they would cut down all the hop vines around an elder, and they would lay them down next to the elder, and then the elder would sit on a chair, for instance, and then they would pick the hops. And so it was a way to make sure that the elderly themselves were able to kind of get work and gain wages too in the workplace. So everyone was kind of looking out for one another in the fields. And it was always struck me about kind of the unique way in which kind of families kind of bonded together, but also and it was kind of very intergenerational, right? It was not only kind of families kind of coming to it was children, parents, and grandparents. So there was kind of this whole kind of this family unit. And that kind of exists, I think, in a lot of contexts. I think that if you kind of looked at even Native communities in Washington, they do the same thing. Native families in Oregon were doing kind of much the same way. So there seems to be kind of what I try to kind of talk about, like kind of a hop culture in Northern California of Native peoples kind of shaping the way in which kind of the hop industry and the hop labor would kind of would work. I think what lessons we could take from Round Valley people in our own kind of working environments. That's a good question. I probably need to kind of think a little bit more on that. But I think it's maybe again, one way to think through that is the lesson we took that I kind of just, or that kind of example that I just talked about with the young man, essentially kind of making sure that his elder had things to do, right? Is kind of making sure of kind of this kind of working together, kind of these kind of more cooperative work activities to make sure that we're all looking out for one another in these kind of sites.
Yeah, it's we spoke about that too in our cohort. It's a very beautiful and would be now considered radical in our world as we dispose of our elderly if they can't work. And it's a different relationship to have.
Yeah, that was. Oh, sorry, T. I apologize for interrupting. I mean, that was another thing that I haven't been able to kind of write about this as much as I wanted to, but the way in which kind of Round Valley was able to kind of consistently kind of had this long narrative or this kind of long history of taking care of elders and taking care of the elderly. And it went beyond kind of work and labor. So it went beyond the hop fields. It was something that was going on when elders were on reservations. So they might live with family members, or elders themselves would live in their own households, right? So I've seen kind of examples of like 3 or 4 elderly people kind of coming together and living in one household, so they could all, again, kind of pool their own resources, pool their labor, and that sort of thing. I do think that there's kind of a shift that happens in this right around kind of the Great Depression, and so I probably need to think a little bit more about this. But there was kind of I did kind of meet or kind of see these efforts of Native peoples on Round Valley, kind of helping and protecting elders, and then kind of going to bat for them and demanding that the federal government uphold its trust responsibility and uphold its responsibility to kind of provide resources for the elderly as well. I think there's an interesting story there that I still am kind of thinking through in my own head.
Definitely. And just that pure practice is something that we can take into our own work now.
Exactly.
Yep. And you'll see when folks are at the picket lines, even now, and at our last session, Appalachian women in the 60s, you were feeding each other on the picket lines. You were caring for one another's children, and you were doing all that work while organizing. So,
yeah, I mean, and actually, I think one of the things that actually struck me too, as I was doing my research, and sometimes this comes up, is that I did find examples of like strikes, right? So I talked a little bit, right, in the 1850s where people would kind of run away from work sites and that sort of thing. But in like the 1880s, 1890s, and into the 20th century, I didn't see kind of a lot of examples of, right, what we kind of consider to be kind of other kind of more prominent examples of say labor history, right, of strikes and that sort of thing. And I'm not sure I couldn't quite kind of get a grip on why that was. And it might be just kind of the absolute kind of the family necessity of going to work. But also, I do think that there was a lot of ways in which Native peoples took control of the workplace and made sure it was kind of amenable to them, right? And so although kind of wages might change, they made sure that everyone had access to the wage. Although, again, kind of there's kind of difficult work conditions. There were other aspects of the work experience of going to the fields that families were able to kind of construct, were able to kind of take advantage of and shape and take control of, right? So whether it was playing grass game or performing ceremony or just making sure the family's together, right? These were reasons where Native peoples would put to work. And maybe to kind of tie a point that something that I mentioned earlier, is a lot of families didn't want their children, for instance, to go to the off-reservation boarding schools. And the beginning of the school year would often coincide with the beginning of the hop picking season. So one reason why families made sure that they took their children to the hop fields was not only to the wage, but it was also a way to prevent them from going to these off-reservation boarding schools. And so it becomes kind of part of their resistance to kind of federal Indian policy and some of these other aspects.
Right, exactly. And I think that's why I psychically made that connection to a strike, because I see so much of their work as resistance in and of itself, the way they brought their families over and opposed these federal policies separating them. Yeah. And there's a question in the chat, and it's relevant to something that we've been wanted to ask is, what is happening in terms of labor on reservations now in Northern California? And if you can, you mentioned the Great Plains and how they receive 300 acres of land and they receive 5 to 10. Like, how does it look different in other places, and what does it look like now?
Oh yeah, I think that's great. So I think so. Let's look at. Let me maybe briefly, so I can kind of trace what happens in Round Valley in terms of labor after World War II. What happens after World War II is we see, right, I think in part because of the kind of the baby boom and kind of the rise of kind of suburban development in the United States, is that we see kind of a lot of timber, the timber industry start to pop up, like cutting down trees and that sort of thing in Northern California. And so that becomes kind of a big job opportunity for a lot of Native peoples in and around Round Valley. So they kind of shift from being kind of migrant farm workers to working in the seasonal timber industry in the 1950s and then well into the 1980s. So that's what my dad, one of the jobs my dad did when I was younger, he was a logger. He worked in the logging industry in Northern California. And then early in the 1990s, the timber industry began to kind of decline, right? And so the mill, the lumber mill that was located in Round Valley near the reservation closed. And I think that was a kind of a big formative event in Round Valley, right? So that's where that those high rates of unemployment began to kind of increase in the 1990s. Right, there wasn't as much federal funding because it had been cut during the Reagan and Bush administrations. On top of the fact then that the lumber industry begins to peter out in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And so we see a kind of a big kind of problematic kind of high rates of unemployment begins to persist. So since then, one of the ways in which people in Round Valley have kind of adapted to these kind of diminished economic times is growing marijuana. Right, so the marijuana industry is kind of big in Northern California. On one hand, it does kind of provide economic resources for people, but I think that there's also kind of attendant kind of environmental problems that are kind of attached to it as well. Right, there's the pollution of water. Actually, kind of given that California is in a drought, people are kind of hoarding water to water plants. So I think that there's kind of a complex kind of economic and labor history that is going on related to kind of the cannabis or the marijuana industry in Northern California since then. In other parts of California, what we see is the casino industry has been able to kind of drive and allow Native peoples to kind of return to reservations to find work, either not often in casinos, but there's other kind of administrative aspects and other kind of economic development opportunities that have been related to the casino industries to kind of gain and provide jobs for Native peoples on and off reservations in California in general. So I think that there might be kind of a switch or kind of a turn, but I think again there needs to be kind of a lot more kind of research and kind of thought about kind of these labor relations in California, especially related to the casino industry. In comparison, I think that I think that's one of the things I was trying to kind of point out in my comment about kind of that I think the pivot of the 1960s, the pivotal moment of the 1960s and 1970s in American Indian labor history. Right? So if you look at the plains, I think you'll see kind of very similar activities, right? Native peoples leaving the reservation to do kind of to do work. I think on Lakota reservations in South Dakota, for instance, Native peoples worked as teamsters, right? So they would be kind of ferrying goods on and off the reservation. And then, and so sometimes as kind of technologies and things would change, Native peoples didn't have the same kind of economic opportunities. And so I again, kind of thinking through these kind of, I think it's kind of interesting. I think more needs to be done there about what happens in this like 60s, 70s, 80s, both kind of structurally in terms of the United States economy, but also kind of in the way in which federal Indian policy that begins to kind of produce these kind of large scale kind of underemployment and unemployment issues on reservations.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of research still yet to be done around federal policies that have undermined their ability to progress in different ways through labor. But we wondered, what was, when you were doing this research, what was scholarship's response to pursuing this? And for us wondering within the colonial structure of the academy too. And I guess between 2009, when you had these two chapters, and now, is there more funding? What are you allowed to study and not study, and kind of trace that for us?
Yeah, I think so. I think that there was two things that I think was good on that report. I mean, when I was beginning this, I went to grad school knowing what I wanted to do, right? I wanted to write a history of where I grew up, of the Round Valley Reservation. I didn't necessarily embark to do a labor history. I think that came a little bit later, but I wanted to write about Round Valley, and I knew how I wanted to write about Round Valley. I needed to include oral histories because, again, that voice was not included in other historical in other research and other examples, and I was then kind of blessed that, or I was supported by a committee and my advisors that allowed me and gave me that kind of latitude to do that kind of project, because I think that they recognized that it was important and necessary to do so, and I think also kind of moving into that, and I think the labor aspect of this was also kind of supported. Because I think other people at the time, it was kind of a newer field. A lot of people hadn't been writing about American Indian labor histories. And so I was kind of at the kind of the beginning stages of these, I think, kind of important and pivotal works on American Indian labor. So a scholar named Brian Hosmer, who's at Oklahoma State University, has written about kind of American Indian labor. Colleen O'Neill, who teaches at Utah State University, was really kind of at the vanguard of this. And then since then, I think I've been pretty kind of forthright about how I was ever going to kind of write history. Right, my history is always going to be supported by oral history and oral tradition. I think it's vital. Because I think it kind of gives a framework for understanding history from a Native perspective. Not only do you get kind of the content of history or the content of texts and research, but also you get kind of the methodologies, the perspectives that Native peoples are bringing to interpreting the past and understanding their present. And so that's been kind of my take. I know that other scholars might not have had that same kind of experiences. I think, some scholars, for instance, I've heard Native scholars are kind of advised not to write about home because they're kind of it's said that they can't be objective and they're still being kind of taught within kind of an older, I think as you just noted, right, a colonial framework. But although I may not be as, I don't know what kind of forthright or prominent as maybe other people in writing about home, I've always been adamant that the only thing that I can do, the things that I feel passionately about are writing about and from home. And I try to instill that in other students, undergraduate and graduate students that I work with.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And there's a lot that we can learn from the ways in which you pursued this research and carrying on oral histories and making sure you write about home in these structures. There are, I think, two questions that I'd like to ask to kind of tie us to present day and to our organizing struggles today. So what connections can we make between the struggles around Valley Indians agricultural work to our current struggles across different sectors today? Your book is titled, We're All Like Migrant Workers Here. There's so much conversation and organizing happening with our migrant workers at the border and agricultural workers here. Do you have any thoughts on that or that connection?
Yeah, well, I actually, right before I came on, I heard about the Supreme Court case that was decided today, right, that was striking down the California union organizing law, or allowing union organizers to come on to corporate farms, right, to talk about organizing. And I think that one thing that I think is striking, and actually this is kind of prominent right now, even in my own thinking, because I'm teaching a class on the Gilded Age right now, and we're actually kind of discussing, right, the role of the nation state in reinforcing kind of corporations and corporate power. And so one of the questions I asked my class this week is, right, I mean, isn't it striking against whom the federal and state governments deploys violence, right? So obviously in United States history, the federal government and state governments have deployed violence against Indigenous people. People have deployed violence against African Americans, like, say, in the Gilded Age with lynchings and that sort of thing. But also think about the ways in which kind of police forces, state governments, National Guards are deployed against striking workers, especially right in the late 19th century. And I think kind of at least kind of recognizing and trying to kind of identify the way in which the nation state plays a role in this kind of struggle, I think is vitally important. And because that's a kind of an everyday kind of presence for kind of American Indian labor history, is not only is it kind of this engagement with kind of corporate farms and corporations, right, and employers, the more traditional kind of labor histories, is that I think, as my talk tried to kind of suss out, is that there's also kind of the role of the federal government here, right? And that the federal government is kind of an overbearing presence in American Indian labor experiences. And I think that that's an unappreciated connection between kind of American Indian labor struggles and American Indian labor organizing, and then the kind of the broader and longer history of labor organizing in the United States. And so I think that is kind of being able to kind of test, I think, state and federal governments about their roles in kind of limiting and kind of putting bulwarks up against kind of workers, I think needs to be kind of recognized, and I think is a lesson that we can take from our American Indian labor history.
Definitely. That is an extremely strong lesson for us to be taking forward. And I think with that, I mean, as organizers, how do we contribute to make this history more known? One of the points that you just said is one of those lessons that we take forward and connections that we can make, but what else comes to mind?
Yeah, that is a great, I think one thing, I think, so whenever I kind of teach classes, right? One of the things I always tell my students is that the history of the United States is a narrative of kind of two things, right? It is the dispossession of indigenous peoples of lands, right? Forcible dispossession through, as I said, kind of through land thefts, through ethnic cleansing, through genocide, through through directed federal policies. Has been about dispossessing indigenous peoples of lands. And then the other part of that is kind of the bringing over of workers to work on dispossessed indigenous people's land. So there is kind of an intimate connection between indigenous people's dispossession of land and the enslavement of African Americans, or even say in the 1940s, right, with the Bracero program, or even Irish immigrants coming over to the United States, right? There is a connection between dispossession of indigenous peoples of lands and kind of the arrival of people into North America to do work under what we would nominally call kind of free labor experiences, and also under slavery and other aspects of unfree labor. And I think kind of recognizing and making those connections kind of clear and promoting those connections, or making people know about those connections, I think is one way we can kind of, I think is one way in which we would be beneficial for working people and American Indian people as well, is kind of raising the awareness of this kind of long history of dispossession of land and the relationship of labor to it.
Absolutely. That is something that we're going to highlight after this as well. That's a very big point. Thank you. I think I've reached the end of my questions here. I'm going to give it a second for the Q&A if anything comes up.
Well, I've been droning on and on for more than an hour now, and I probably people are tired of me.
Yeah. William, thank you so much for today's talk. I open it up to you if anything that you want to say closing, any other thoughts come to mind.
No, actually, just thank you for inviting me. I haven't been invited to a kind of an event like this and kind of a perspective on this. And I think some of even the questions that you were asking, right, is trying to kind of think about kind of what is the role of kind of American Indian labor in these issues. And I think it's a voice it's a story that often isn't told. And I'm thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share my stories and with you and the audience.
Yep, we are so grateful to you. And this is one of the ways in which we're bridging that gap between the histories that haven't been told, that we don't get to learn as much, and organizing struggles today. And we're grateful and thank you so much. Wishing you a great night. Stay in touch with the network.
You too. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you, everyone.
Goodbye. Goodbye.